to be here at the Dublin Tech Summit. My name is David Singleton, and as you just heard, I'm the CTO of Stripe. And today I want to talk with all of you about infrastructure. So in my mind, infrastructure projects are defined by two key attributes. First, they are big, they are bold and ambitious. They have the potential to shape the character of a region and the future of entire economies. And they can provide leverage to individuals at really massive scale. Second, no matter how big or breathtaking a piece of infrastructure is, it quickly fades into the background of our everyday lives. And that is a good thing. Great infrastructure is quiet, it's reliable, it helps people achieve their goals without getting in the way. And when we think about big infrastructure projects, some of the most obvious are in the realm of transportation. This is a picture of one of the entrances to the Channel Tunnel. And the construction of the Channel Tunnel is a phenomenal engineering feat. To this day, it's the longest continuous underwater tunnel in the whole world. And each year, more than 10 million people travel through the tunnel by rail, oftentimes along with their cars, their goods, and so much more. But that's not really the full story, because for generations, people have looked across the channel, and they've dreamed of better ways to link Britain to the European mainland. Prior to the 1800s, ships like this cutter were the primary means of transporting goods and services. And in the mid-1800s, the famous Dover to Calais ferry, which was via paddle steamer back then, began its run. Then starting in 1800, engineers began trying to actually dig under the channel rather than sail over it. One of the very first plans came from mining engineer Albert Mathieu Favier around 1802, who proposed a tunnel that would be lit by lamps for stagecoaches. Construction on the very first Channel Tunnel actually started all the way back in 1880 using these steampunk boring machines, but it was cancelled due to political pressure. And actually, inside the present tunnel, you can still find graffiti that was left by the workers at that very first 1880 dig site. And that's over 150 years ago, which just goes to show that people love leaving Easter eggs in their work. Some interesting transit ideas were tried after World War II. And even when construction plans were being finalized in the 1980s, the British government was pushing hard for an alternative design that would have seen cars driving all 31 miles underground. And if that wasn't enough, at its completion, it wasn't even clear that the Channel Tunnel would be a financial success either. Not least because when the tunnels on the French and English sides finally met, the project was well over budget, having cost £9 billion rather than the forecasted £5.5 billion. But despite all these setbacks, despite all the delays and the cost overruns and the cancelled projects, the tunnel is a roaring success. And it's a success because of its obvious utility. It's just a better way to move people from point A to point B. It's a success because it enables the value of other networks to compound too, like connecting high-speed rail between London and Paris, simplifying the cross-market transmission of goods, and even joining power transmission networks between the UK and Europe. And these network effects actually reach beyond Britain and France as well. For instance, historically, all of our energy links to the EU here in Ireland have relied on Britain's cross-channel connections, including through the Channel Tunnel. And I'd argue that it's ultimately successful because the idea of the tunnel has held people's imaginations. For nearly 200 years, it just seemed like something that should happen. It was something that could obviously make people's lives easier. The hard part was making such a long-term project successful in an ever-changing world. So what is it that makes infrastructure successful? Well, that's something we think about a lot at Stripe, where our mission is to build economic infrastructure for the internet. We power millions of businesses, ranging from some of the largest companies in the world to the smallest startups and solopreneurs. And our business is kind of like a transit network. Just as the purpose of a rail tunnel is to move people and goods, the purpose of Stripe's infrastructure is to allow businesses to store and move money in a way that's fast, functional, and frictionless. And we need to do that in a way that can grow and evolve alongside the internet to accommodate the needs of any type of business at any size. We also need to be able to integrate with financial networks, those of today and those that are yet to come. And that's one of the big advantages about infrastructure that isn't physical. It can actually adapt and change more quickly. And that brings us to what I want to focus on in this talk today, change. In fact, we've been working on a project in London and across Europe to re-engineer how bank transfers work around the world. We're building a system that dramatically improves the infrastructure underlying one of the oldest payment methods that we have, automating away millions of combined hours of manual administration. So how do we manage change like that in our infrastructure? Well, this is a framework that some of you might have heard of before. It's called pace layering. And it was introduced by Stuart Brand of the Long Now Foundation. And most famously, Brand discusses this concept in a book about watchmaking. Well, that's not exactly true. He discusses it in a book about the clock of the long now, which is an attempt to build a mechanical clock using watchmaking techniques that can run uninterrupted for 10,000 years. And with such an audacious goal, they needed to consider not just the design, the building, the maintenance, but also the deep structure that enables these processes to continue over time. And that's the key concept of the pace layering framework, that the way we build things and the way that we organize and operate in organizations can be broken down as part of a hierarchical system that's defined by the rate of change. And I'm going to use the Channel Tunnel as an example to illustrate these points. At the top there, you see fashion, the squiggly line, which illustrates how fads tend to come and go. The places people travel to, or the reasons people make the journey, might change day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Next is commerce. In the case of the tunnel, this is things like the market forces that dictate how many trains run, how frequently, and what goes on them. Then there's infrastructure. The tunnel itself, the rail lines, the power transmission cables, they exist at this pace layer. And then there's governance, how we codify our culture and build processes so that we can work together. The tunnel was made possible not only by a private-public partnership, but also an international treaty signed by the UK and France, which has endured for decades. Next is culture. The tunnel was born out of an era of increased partnerships and globalization. And down at the bottom, you have the physical constraints, the matter and substance that literally shaped the project and dictated its needs. And the point here is that stuff at the top of the framework, those pace layers, change very rapidly, and stuff at the bottom hardly changes at all over time. And if you're a parent, then I think this framework might make intuitive sense. I mean, if you've ever had to explain to a child why things are the way they are, you quickly find yourself traversing many of these layers. And I am a proud parent, and in fact, here's a drawing that my daughter did of the framework, and I might be biased. Take a proper look at this. I might be biased, but I think this version might be even better than the original. She'll be very happy with that round of applause. Well, we think about pace layers really often at Stripe when we're figuring out how our infrastructure and our company should evolve. Between the layers, there's a push and pull of creative tension, with the only constant being change. Governance models can affect culture, just as cultural expectations can lead to changes in governance and so on. So to explain how Stripe grew over our first decade, this is where I want to start, talking about the culture. Very early on, the founding team at Stripe made a decision that our company culture would be built not on an abstract set of philosophical values, but rather on a set of operating principles that were distilled from the behaviors of the most effective Stripes. And the very first operating principle that we established was users first. If there's nothing else that you take away from this presentation, then I hope you remember this principle. We emphasize it more than any other point during our new hire process, and we reinforce it at every company-wide weekly meeting where we try to bring in a real customer, a real user, to tell us what's working and what isn't. And we're constantly making sure that we live out the principle of users first, because we know that it's not nearly enough to merely stick it on the wall. In fact, to illustrate that point, here's a set of values from another company: communication, integrity, excellence, and respect. Well, those actually seem like a pretty good set of values to aspire to, but it's important to remember which company they actually come from. And I think that's a very good lesson for all of us. Nothing guarantees that our values will be lived at our companies unless they're also embodied by us and everyone that we work with. So this orientation towards our users goes back to Stripe's original purpose. Stripe began in 2010 to solve a seemingly simple problem that our founders had experienced several times in their own careers. It was very difficult for startups to start accepting payments online. There were many reasons why. Banks often weren't interested in working with startups. Payment networks had clunky or poorly documented integrations. Compliance requirements could be confusing. And once you were actually able to accept payments in one market, you had to go through all that same palaver again in order to expand into new markets. Payments online were far from a user's first experience. And so in the early days, we focused on addressing the biggest barriers that prevented payments from working for our users. We knew that the core API needed to be a durable piece of infrastructure, and that any changes we made to it would need to be additive and gradual to avoid placing the burden on users to adapt to us unless it was absolutely necessary. And before Stripe even had a product, we actually ended up rewriting the core API 3 times, to achieve the right level of functionality, adaptability, and simplicity. And when we did finally launch our first product, we were able to provide payments functionality to customers with only a few lines of code because we took care of the other pain points of implementation that we'd observed from them when we worked together. For instance, paperwork. Registering with payments processors in the early days took tons and tons of paperwork that startups simply didn't have the time to fill out. So we let them outsource their paperwork to us. We simply filled it out for them. And similarly, our founders, this is a pretty cool picture, would sometimes physically sit down with users and write the code they needed to get up and running with Stripe. Paul Graham used to refer to this as the Collison installation, and it demonstrates the power of making things as simple as possible for the people that you want to adopt your product. We also didn't assume that we knew everything there was to know about our users' pain points. We were really obsessed about detecting and fixing every suboptimal speed bump in the product. In those early days, every single API error would actually trigger an email to Patrick's inbox, and every support ticket would page our executive cell phones. We pair-programmed those first Stripe integrations with our users, and to this day, the original IRC channel that we used to gather feedback from them has its spiritual successor on Discord. And so working closely with our most opinionated users provides a strong feedback loop that increases the speed at which we can adapt to our users' needs. By listening to those early users, we learned about problems adjacent to the ones that we had identified ourselves. Besides the Stripe API, we created Stripe.js, a JavaScript library to collect card payments securely from the browser and securely store them with Stripe, represented as a token, which can later be used to charge a card. And that helps users offload the burden of PCI compliance to us initially. We store the credit card numbers, and they don't have to. Our users' first approach also applied to how we organized our internal processes. Think of this as the governance layer in the pace layer model. For example, let's discuss our API design and review process. That's how we got the API working the way it does at scale. Our API design and review process is an example of how long-term thinking directly informs the way we organize our work at Stripe. Stripe is an API company. Almost every aspect of our infrastructure is exposed to our users via APIs that they build into their products. So to maximize the value that our users can get from our APIs, it's important that they are as simple as possible, but also that they're composable. They need to work well together, and they need to be predictable. They need to behave the way you'd expect, and also change as frequently or as infrequently as the concepts that they represent in the real world. In fact, we are about to get fractal here. We think very hard when we are working on APIs at Stripe about which pace layer in our broader ecosystem each idea that we encode into our API sits at, so we can plan for faster and slower rates of change over time. At the governance layer, there are laws and standards that economic infrastructure needs to comply with, stuff like GDPR and anti-money laundering regulations. And above that, we have core concepts in our API, like accounts and transactions. So those are universal. They're going to change really rarely. And then at the top layer, we have the concepts that we're innovating on. These are intentionally designed to change faster in concert with our first users. So early in the design process, we scrutinize our plans with a standardized API review, which keeps these principles in mind. The API review team itself draws trained reviewers from across the company, creating a cross-functional team that can also standardize best practices, share knowledge, and advocate for change when that change is necessary. The #1 principle basis underlying all of our work is a focus on designing for users. So we typically try to get an early version of any product out into the world as a closed beta as quickly as possible so we can get feedback from them and iterate. But keeping pace layering in mind is really important. It helps us make sure we live up to our commitments, like not promising users functionality that we know we can't deliver at scale. And over those first years, we refined our mission to build economic infrastructure for the entire internet. Now, I hope I've stressed enough that building infrastructure and designing for the future means being responsive to users' needs. One of our early users was a ride-sharing company that was quickly scaling. They needed a way to both accept payments from riders and immediately pay out to their drivers. To solve this for them, we iterated and developed two products: Stripe Connect, which handles bi-directional payments in multi-party online marketplaces, and Payouts, which provides drivers the ability to decide when they want to get paid out, and that's often within a few hours of taking a ride. Today, these products are the economic infrastructure for several online marketplaces and many gig economy companies. They're also still being used by that ride-sharing company that led us to develop them in the first place, Lyft. So that was the first 5 years of Stripe. But like many other companies, the true challenge isn't how you build the first product, but what comes afterwards. As I said a few minutes ago, this story is fundamentally about change. As we grew, we went from supporting thousands of users to supporting millions, from primarily serving small companies to counting massive Fortune 100 companies and online platforms as our biggest users. Along the way, we experienced the same growing pains that many of you have probably experienced in your own companies. We've had to adapt to a changing user base. We've had to scale our technology and navigate the challenges that come with being a much larger and more complex company than we used to be. We've also learned from the companies that have preceded us. And we've been emboldened by the fact that what we've learned has often validated our approach and many of those operating principles that we already had. For example, we would often talk publicly about how important it is to be deliberate about how your company grows and to build the kind of corporate culture that always looks to make the right choices, not just the easy ones. Well, one of the biggest changes we've had to make was the launch of our remote engineering hub. So let's rewind a few years. It was 2019, and it seemed like the future of remote work was here, but it just wasn't evenly distributed yet. We had all the tools that we still have today: Slack, GitHub, Zoom, everything that you need to make remote work work. And by the way, all those companies are Stripe users. But still, there was this hesitancy to embrace the technology that we already had available and trust that we could work just as well from anywhere. So like many companies, we already had major engineering hubs all over the world with hundreds of high-impact distributed employees. So we knew that engineers could contribute effectively on creative work regardless of physical proximity. But before the pandemic, 99.74% of the software engineers in the world lived outside the metro areas of Stripe's first 4 hubs, which were in San Francisco, Dublin, Seattle, and Singapore. So we launched remote work as a 5th hub, meaning that we invest in remote just like we would any office. And we quickly found that we should have done it earlier. That's because we quickly saw that remote employees kept us even closer to our users. They live in more places. They can see the struggles and successes of local businesses in an online economy. They know the pains of having slow or unreliable internet connections, and they understand the importance of having access to global payments infrastructure. As we grew in scale, we also found that being distributed put us in a better position than other companies to solve a range of business problems that our users faced. For example, many of our users eventually reach a stage in their growth where they begin to think about international expansion. But without understanding the intricacies of local consumer behavior in all those other countries, the business norms and even the banking systems, it really holds them back. If your company wants to start operating in Japan, for instance, you probably don't know about the importance of Japanese convenience stores, which are known as konbini. Konbini payments are an online-offline hybrid model where the consumer places an order online and then receives a payment code and a confirmation number. They then bring that information to their local convenience store to make a cash payment. That might sound a bit odd to us here in Ireland, but it's the second most popular method of payment in Japan, accounting for almost 1 in 5 online purchases. Now, on a certain level, the Konbini network is doing the same thing for Japanese consumers that we do at Stripe. It's offering people a way to do business that is secure, reliable, and responsive to their needs and desires. And our job is to be a bridge between that network and our users. At Stripe, we found that solving that problem was so important that it actually needed to become the foundation of our business. We created the Global Payments and Treasury Network, or GPTN, that today connects banks, payment methods, and money transfer methods. It also defines a set of user-facing abstractions, the Stripe API, that are used to build many of our products and functions as a kind of operating system for money movement internally. Building the GPTN required a massive lift from our team to get off the ground, but we knew that if we wanted to build enduring infrastructure, we needed to be able to support the growth of our users. And as we grew, our ability to solve problems improved, but we also had to be much, much more active when it came to soliciting feedback. By 2019, we had many teams across the company continuously talking to and learning from users, including our UX research teams, product managers, deployment teams, support engineers, and developer experience teams. In fact, we encourage every single person at Stripe to talk to our users in whatever capacity they operate. And we would even ask our users for feedback when they made guest appearances at company all-hands meetings. Genuinely, every time we have a customer into one of our all-hands meetings, they show up and they get grilled for feedback. These foundational aspects of our organization seemed important even as we were creating them. Multiple feedback channels, remote work, and a shared set of operating principles. But like every other company out there, our ability to execute would be tested by what was to come in 2020. Existential crises and black swan events are a rare but unavoidable fact of life. Going back to the Channel Tunnel, it too faced existential crises. In the 1980s, political leadership almost killed the project. Shortly after it opened, there was a massive fire. No one knows what future hazards lurk ahead, but we know from history that useful infrastructure often has incredible endurance. Among many other lessons, the last 2 years have made infrastructure we all took for granted plainly visible, warts and all. Some of that is physical infrastructure, global supply chains and medical facilities, but increasingly it's also digital infrastructure that our lives and livelihoods depend on. The pandemic was a massive existential stress test to all of that. And the pandemic didn't break the world's economy, but it did send out shockwaves that continue to ripple today. From disrupted supply chains to worker shortages, there's so much uncertainty. As people spent more time at home and services like online shopping and food delivery became an everyday necessity, we had to scale quickly. We also saw urgent needs to build onto services that we'd already had, like Connect. Here's an example. We launched Stripe Express, which is a mobile app built on top of our core Connect primitives. It handles onboarding, payouts management, reporting taxes, and all the common things that a platform needs, whether it's built for creators, gig workers, or it's an online platform like WooCommerce. And it's trying to help people go from the offline economy to the online economy. Having everyone online also means that we had to work even harder to get feedback from our users. But sometimes you can tell what people think just by reading what they're talking about on Twitter. We love it when we tweet like this and people tell us about the friction that they run into using Stripe or just running their business online. It's been a great way to be able to channel complaints about friction into new functionality Stripe provides to our users so that those users, in turn, can extend it to their customers. For example, did you know that 37% of small businesses actually earn their first euro before they have a business bank account? Well, recently, Shopify launched a product called Balance, and it's powered by Stripe Treasury, and it provides a simple money management account for their customers' online businesses. Their customers can access the money they make through Shopify in the same interface as their store. That means they can get paid faster, they pay fewer fees, they have another less point of friction in their daily lives. So you've heard the term fintech revolution. Well, this is what it looks like. Shopify is doing for their customers what Stripe does for users like Shopify, helping them get their businesses up and running with less friction and helping them move money faster. Another common complaint we heard in those tweets was about taxes. You may wonder, what has the gingerbread man got to do with taxes? Well, we found that half of our users said that changing tax requirements were really hard to follow. For example, in the UK, if a gingerbread man has just 2 chocolate eyes, it's legally a biscuit, and that means it's tax exempt. However, if that gingerbread man is also wearing chocolate trousers or a shirt, it's now legally taxed at a standard rate of 20%. So I hope you can begin to appreciate how the kinds of edge cases that arise when you're doing this across 130 countries and dealing with all manner of baked goods and sartorial combinations is really complicated. This combination of pervasiveness and complexity pointed towards the need for a convenient solution that could work at scale. So our Dublin team developed Stripe Tax, which automates tax calculation and collection. It tells businesses where they need to collect taxes and creates comprehensive reports to make filing taxes easy. But we also recognize that we're just definitely not the only people with good ideas about how to extend our infrastructure, which led to our most recent initiative that lets people build and host apps directly on Stripe. The Stripe App Marketplace lets developers build and sell software and services to any business that use the Stripe dashboard. Right now, the new Stripe App Marketplace includes apps from companies like ChargeDesk, Intercom, Vayu, Xero, and more. But we want to make this a platform where any developer can connect directly with our payments and financial services infrastructure to solve their users' problems. Just like our payments users can leverage Stripe to access new markets, developers can now decide what the future of that fintech revolution should look like, and I hope you'll all give it a try. So we're excited to open up the platform, allowing developers to customize Stripe in ways that have never been possible before, while leveraging the full power of our APIs. As I wrap up my talk, I want to highlight one last point about governance and how it can ensure that shared infrastructure can be trusted over very long periods of time. This image is from a meeting of the Tribunal de las Aguas de la Vega de la Valencia, or the Water Court of the Plains of Valencia. It's the world's oldest judicial body. It was established in 960 CE, and it has operated continuously since then in an area called La Huerta outside of Valencia, Spain. The farming community there has an incredibly efficient, gravity-fed irrigation system which links every field in the valley. Every farmer has the same access and rights to their share. And over thousands of years, governments have come and gone, the crops grown in the fields have changed, but the water court has remained. And I think the secret to the longevity of organizations, and that one in particular, is that the farmers in the area are inextricably linked by infrastructure, the canals and ditches that irrigate their fields, and the shared culture of their farming community. Which brings us to the present day and how we deal with this challenge at Stripe. We build for our users today, but we think about what our platform should look like tomorrow. We interview users carefully and consider patterns of feedback, but we remember that every new feature that we add will need to be supported for a very long time. We provide an infrastructure that's open to more developers, but safe and reliable for our mutual customers. And finally, through every iteration of our operating principles, we've never lost track of that priority that got us started: users first.